So in recent weeks, we've had more rumours claiming that Christopher Nolan is the main candidate to direct the next James Bond movies, and I wanted to address what those rumours contained. But on top of this, having talked about this topic many times before, I'd mainly focused on the reasons why Nolan would actually do it. And in my own opinion, I think there's many reasons why he wouldn't at this point in time as well. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing the recent rumours surrounding Christopher Nolan directing the next James Bond film, whether that source is trustworthy, and mainly why I don't think he will. Before I get into it though, if you want to keep up to date on any of my content surrounding Christopher Nolan and whatever his next film does turn out to be, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's dive into why Christopher Nolan won't direct James Bond. So we've spoken many times on the channel before about there always being this possibility for Christopher Nolan to do a James Bond film. And in recent months, especially after the release of Oppenheimer, the speculation has again risen over the director taking it on as his next project. I feel like after every Nolan film releases in recent memory, there's been rumours or speculation over him doing it, and don't get me wrong, I do get excited when I hear the prospect of it happening. Nolan himself has been heavily influenced by those movies, and it's clear that his trademarks in blockbuster cinema have been built on the many iconic action moments or visual cues of those films. Whether it be the snowy heist of Inception, the opening of The Dark Knight Rises, or so on. And yet he'd of course want to reinvent or do something different for the franchise if he did it today. Now, when a new rumour comes out and it claims that Nolan wants to take a new approach, people instantly want to believe it and buy into the idea that a Nolan Bond film is happening. And the article from World of Real, which came out about 2 weeks ago, claims that the director is said to be in talks with Bond producer Barbara Broccoli to direct the next 2 or 3 films in the franchise. They again state that he apparently has some concerns regarding his creative freedom and the direction he wants to take it in. But the report also says that Nolan wants to make faithful adaptations of the original Ian Fleming novels in period settings. The original books, of course, began with Casino Royale and were set in the 1950s and 60s. Christopher Nolan previously talked about his interest in making a James Bond film during an interview on the Happy Sad Confused podcast, saying, "The influence of those movies in my filmography is embarrassingly apparent. It would be an amazing privilege to do one. At the same time, when you take on a character like that, you're working with a particular set of constraints. It has to be the right moment in your creative life where you can express what you want to express and really burrow into something within the appropriate constraints, because you would never want to take on something like that and do it wrong." Now, this is not a critique of World of Real or their article, but when this started spreading all over the internet, people believed that World of Real was a respectable film news source. I've seen many posts that they've put up surrounding Nolan, Dune, and other movies or filmmakers, and I have to be honest, a lot of the time it turns out to be just rumours. Again, I'm not attacking them or their sources, I'm just stating that a lot of the articles they put up don't turn out to be true. But putting it aside that this article has possibly been posted more as a rumour, what are the main reasons why I think Christopher Nolan is not doing James Bond? Well, first, like I said in my last video on this topic, it is the right time for Nolan to do Bond if he is doing it. Since the Dark Knight films, he's had multiple meetings with the Bond producers discussing his potential to take on a film. Yes, those talks never materialised, but the director made it clear that if he was to do it, he would want to put his spin on it. So returning to a franchise with a property that fits his blockbuster style, one that he's he's always wanted to make, and one that a lot of the time allows for a sense of reinvention and freshness with every film, would sound quite ideal. At the same time though, I don't think Nolan is at the stage of his career where he actually needs to do it. Like I said in a previous video, Nolan has been out of the franchise game for a good 11 years now, and his career has developed with original films. We've seen in recent years directors be attached to Bond, sign on, and then leave because they don't think they could actually bring something that fits with their creative style. Yes, Nolan is probably the closest to doing Bond well as a popular auteur with inspired conventions, but after making successful original films and historical stories more recently, coming back to a franchise that inspired him feels unneeded. Now, of course, Bond is in a situation where it can be rebooted, and the end of No Time to Die made that a possibility. And say the story is starting over, I'm a believer that any filmmaker can take on any project, do it their way, stay faithful to the material, and make a bloody good film out of it. But like Nolan said in his interview with that podcast, you'd need to be needed. To make the Bond film that he'd want to make, the Broccolis would have to give him a lot of control and let him reinvent, not just through storytelling, but through all elements of production, so that he could fully deliver his vision of it. He's not the filmmaker to take an idea or script from someone else and then combine that with flavours of his filmmaking style. He'd have to feel comfortable with it and know that this would limit his vision for a Bond movie. When he did the Dark Knight films, he was early on in his filmmaking career, and Batman on film was essentially dead in a ditch. He convinced the studio to trust his vision, and the rest was history. You could argue that the Bond producers could allow the same thing to happen and let Nolan, with no limitations, make a Bond trilogy that he envisions for the franchise. But right now, Nolan is at the peak of his career, making films that are original or historical stories that haven't had the full epic treatment. He did his franchise, made it work, and then from that success, he's gone on to write and direct a lot of his own stuff. He's doing other projects and turning them into new success stories for the studios. So why would he change? Why would he go back to a franchise and try and put his stamp on it again? Also, we've literally just had an adaptation of James Bond that depicts his story across multiple movies. Before that, we had a lot of movies in the franchise that were able to be watched more individually. If Nolan did Bond, he'd want to show the journey of his character and go beyond the traditional emotional beats we get with him, which tend to be interweaved into an individual film. His dead lover or the relationship with his parents have all been alluded to before, but in Daniel Craig's films, we did get more of that connective emotion, and I doubt that Nolan would then be next in line to do another multiple film arc or journey of that character. I think Eon and the Broccolis would want to focus on bringing back that separated film approach, especially after what we've just had with the Craig films. And I also think that this is probably why Nolan made a film like Tenet. With Tenet, he was able to do his espionage idea with no limitations. He showed what his Bond movie may have looked like, added that Nolan approach to sci-fi, and gave us a multi-layered subjective telling of it. He didn't need to do a spy movie for Bond because he could make his own original take on the genre this far into his career. So overall, Christopher Nolan is the type of filmmaker that you'd want to direct any project. Him attached to a Bond movie, of course, is exciting, and many of us would say at this point in his career, with his consistent track record, that he would make a brilliant film. But attaching him to a Bond movie, having nearly no limitations, and making it as a Nolan movie first, is something that I think isn't in the producers or Nolan's interests at this point. Now, of course, I may be proven wrong, and with this restart for Bond, it may essentially be a great time to do it. But with recent Bond films further having a stark comparison with Nolan's blockbuster work themselves, like with Skyfall for instance, I just think that Nolan would want to continue what he's doing now, and that is to make unpredictable original films in multiple genres with no franchise weight or limitations. Again, the future may prove me and others wrong, but recent recent history tells us that Nolan just isn't needed by them right now, and Nolan himself has other films to make. But that was my video discussing why I think Christopher Nolan won't direct the next James Bond movie. I think this is the last video that I'll be doing on this topic, and I'll only really return to it if it actually becomes a bigger possibility. But yeah, the source that this new rumour was shared in is not very credible, and as a whole, I think it's very unlikely that we'll see it. It'll be interesting to see what Nolan does do next though, and if I had to be honest, he tends to surprise us from film to film, and we can expect that he'll direct something very unpredictable. Yes, now is probably the best chance he'll have to do Bond because of the restart, but the trajectory of his work and the types of Bond films we've had recently make it, in my opinion, quite unlikely that we'll see it. Nolan, yes, wants to make something he's interested in and aim to put his own stamp on it, but he also wants to approach something that he thinks he can truly add to. I just think with how Bond has been influenced by Nolan's blockbuster work in recent times, and how the filmmaker has gone on a run of filming a lot of his own ideas, that it becomes difficult to see it happening. We'll have to see, but whether he does Bond or a film within a different genre next, I'm sure we'll all be excited to see it. But what do you think towards the recent rumours, and do you agree that Christopher Nolan will not direct the next James Bond movie? Let me know down below in the comment section. For much more videos and updates on Christopher Nolan and his future films, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like rating and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.